I'm Scarlett, 42, female, and my siblings who laughed when I offered to care for our dad are now suing me after learning I'm a millionaire. It sounds like the plot of a low-budget movie, the kind you scroll past on a streaming service without a second thought, but it's my life. The legal documents sitting on my kitchen counter are a testament to that. They feel heavier than paper ought to, weighted down by years of casual cruelty and the final, stunning act of betrayal from the only two people on Earth who shared my childhood. My older brother Mark and sister Chloe always had a fixed idea of who I was. In the neat alphabetized filing cabinet of their minds, I was filed under S for Scarlett, the surprising, slightly strange, and ultimately unserious sister. They were the anchors, and I was the kite tethered to the family by a string they seemed to think was fragile. Mark, 6 years my senior, sold real estate. He wore his ambition like a well-tailored suit, always talking about closing, escrow, and market trends. He had a wife, 2 kids in private school, and a mortgage that seemed to be his primary personality trait. To Mark, success was tangible. It was a lawn you could manicure, a car you could polish, a title you could put on a business card. My life, lived largely through a laptop screen, was an abstraction he couldn't respect. Chloe, 3 years older than me, was a school administrator. She was organized, pragmatic, and possessed a quiet air of superiority that could curdle milk. She believed in systems, in pensions, in following a clear and predictable path. She had her life mapped out by the time she was 20, and to her, my meandering career path was a source of constant, low-grade pity. She'd often pat my arm at family gatherings and say things like, "It's so nice that you've found a little hobby that pays the bills, dear." That little hobby was software development. While they were climbing their respective corporate and academic ladders, I was in my small apartment learning to code. I was fascinated by creating things from scratch, by building digital tools that could solve real-world problems. I co-founded a small tech startup with a friend from college. We worked tirelessly, fueled by cheap coffee and a shared vision. We weren't flashy. We didn't chase headlines or venture capital. We just built a good, solid product that solved a very specific logistical problem for shipping companies. To my family, I was just playing on the computer in my pajamas. They had no idea that our quiet, unassuming company was growing steadily and significantly year after year. I remember one Christmas dinner, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, that perfectly captured our dynamic. Mark was holding court at the head of the table, booming about a multi-million-dollar property he'd just sold. "It's all about the face-to-face, the handshake," he declared, giving me a pointed look. "You can't build an empire from your living room." Chloe chimed in, ever his backup vocalist. "He's right, Scarlett. Don't you ever feel like you're missing out on, the real world, collaborating with people in person?" I tried to explain. "I collaborate with my team every day. We use video calls, shared documents, instant messaging. It's incredibly efficient. The office is wherever I open my laptop." Mark scoffed, waving his fork dismissively. "It's not the same. It's not a real job. It's a gig." My dad, whose mind was still sharp then, tried to defend me. "Now, Mark, leave your sister alone. She's doing very well for herself." But they didn't hear him. To them, my success was invisible because it didn't look like theirs. I didn't have a corner office or a title like vice principal. I just had a company that was, unbeknownst to them, becoming a quiet powerhouse in its niche industry. I never corrected their assumptions. I never felt the need to. Their validation wasn't the fuel I ran on. I loved them because they were my family, but I had long ago accepted that they would never truly understand my life. So I just smiled and passed the gravy. This dynamic of dismissiveness became dangerously sharp when our dad's health began to decline. It started subtly. He'd forget names, misplace his keys more often, or get lost on a route he'd driven for 40 years. My mom had passed away from cancer a decade prior, and Dad had managed his independence fiercely since then. But now that independence was fraying at the edges. The official diagnosis of dementia was a heavy blow. We had a family meeting, Mark, Chloe, and I, at Dad's house. The air in the familiar living room was thick with unspoken anxieties. Mark, predictably, took the lead. "Okay," he said, pacing in front of the fireplace. "Here's the situation. My career is at a critical stage. I'm up for a partnership. My kids need me. I can't be the primary caregiver. I can contribute financially, of course. We'll find a great facility for him. Chloe nodded, her expression a careful mask of sorrowful pragmatism. My hands are tied as well. The school district is a mess and I'm working 60-hour weeks. Plus, you know how Michael's soccer schedule is. It's just not feasible for me to be here every day. A home is the most logical solution. They both looked at me, the unspoken assumption hanging in the air, that my gig of a job made me the most available, that my childless, unmarried status meant my time was less valuable. Before they could formally nominate me, I spoke. He's not going to a home, I said quietly, but with a firmness that surprised them. Not while I can still care for him. He wants to be in his own house, we all know that. A flicker of relief washed over their faces, quickly replaced by skepticism. Scarlett, be realistic, Chloe said, her tone dripping with condescension. Do you have any idea what this entails? This isn't just making him dinner and reminding him to take his pills. It's a full-time job, it's draining. She's right, Mark added. You're not equipped for this, you have no medical training, you have your computer thing to do. I can manage my work, I said, my voice level. My partner and I sold our company a while ago. I'm financially secure and my schedule is my own. I can do this. The moment I said financially secure, their ears perked up, but they interpreted it through their own lens. They assumed I meant I had a nice little nest egg enough to get by without a 9 to 5. The idea that I was a multi-millionaire was so far outside their conception of me that the thought couldn't even form. They didn't ask what I meant. They didn't care. They just heard that I wasn't going to ask them for money. Well, if you're sure you can handle it, Mark said, leaning back, the posture of a man who had just dodged a bullet. If you think you're up to the task. "Well, I am," I said. The decision was made. They would be the financial contributors and distant well-wishers. I would be the one on the front lines. I would be the one to hold my father's hand as his world and his memory of it slowly faded away. I moved back into my childhood home, set up my workstation in my old bedroom, and prepared for the hardest job of my life. I had no illusions about the difficulty, but I was resolved. He was my dad. He had cared for me my whole life. Now it was my turn. I had no idea that this act of love would one day be reframed as a calculated, malicious plot. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of establishing new routines. I was navigating a landscape of doctor's appointments, medication schedules, and the bewildering terrain of my father's mind. Some days were good. We'd sit in the garden and he'd tell me stories about his youth with perfect clarity, his eyes twinkling with the memory. On those days, I could almost fool myself into believing this was just a temporary fog that would soon lift. Then there were the bad days, days filled with confusion, frustration, and a deep, echoing sadness. He would look at me, his daughter, with the vacant eyes of a stranger, asking where his wife was. Explaining that mom had been gone for 10 years was a fresh heartbreak every time. The dementia was a thief, sneaking in during the night and stealing pieces of the man I knew, leaving behind a bewildered ghost in his place. The incident that would become the cornerstone of my siblings' narrative against me happened on a Tuesday morning, about a month after I'd moved in. Mark and Chloe had scheduled their first, and what would turn out to be one of their very few joint visits. They were checking in, as they put it, with the air of inspectors conducting a formal audit. That morning was already a difficult one. Dad had been agitated since he woke up, pacing the hallways and muttering to himself. I knew from the pamphlets the doctor gave me that this was called sundowning, even though it was happening in the bright light of day. His internal clock was broken. I finally managed to coax him into the kitchen, hoping a familiar meal would soothe him. I made him a bowl of warm oatmeal with a little brown sugar and cinnamon, just the way he used to like it. I placed the bowl in front of him at the kitchen table. He stared at it, his brow furrowed in anger. "What's this?" he asked, his voice sharp. "It's oatmeal, Dad," I said gently, "your favorite." He picked up the spoon, poked at the mushy contents, and then slammed the spoon down on the table, making me jump. "This isn't what I wanted. I wanted mashed potatoes." "I know, but it's breakfast, Dad. We can have mashed potatoes for lunch, how about that?" I was using the calm, redirecting voice the support group leader had taught me. Stay calm, validate the feeling, redirect the action. "No, I want them now," he shouted, his face turning red. "Why can't you get anything right?" My heart ached. I knew it was the disease talking, not him, but the words still stew. NG scraping against nerves already worn raw from lack of sleep and constant worry. I was about to speak again when the doorbell rang. It was Mark and Chloe, right on time. I opened the door, forcing a weak smile. Hey, come on in. They breezed past me into the kitchen, their presence instantly changing the energy in the room. Mark was wearing a crisp suit and Chloe had on a tailored blazer. They looked like they had just stepped out of a boardroom, not into a house heavy with sickness and confusion. "What's all the shouting about?" Mark asked, his eyes immediately landing on the scene at the table, Dad red-faced and angry, me looking exhausted, and the bowl of oatmeal the source of the conflict. Dad seized on the new audience. "She won't give me my mashed potatoes," he complained, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "She's starving me." I closed my eyes for a second, gathering my strength. "Dad, we talked about this. It's oatmeal for breakfast. We can make potatoes for lunch." Mark walked over and peered into the bowl with a look of theatrical disgust. He didn't speak to Dad. He didn't try to comfort him or assess the situation. He turned his gaze on me, a smug, contemptuous smirk playing on his lips. "Oh, this isn't mashed potatoes, you idiot," he said. The words, spoken with such casual cruelty, landed like a punch to the gut. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout. It was a simple, dismissive statement of fact as he saw it. In that one sentence, he wasn't just commenting on the food, he was passing judgment on my entire effort, on my capability, on my worth. And then Chloe laughed. It wasn't a big, booming laugh. It was a short, sharp little sound, a snort of derisive amusement. It was the sound of agreement. It was the sound of two people completely aligned against me. I felt the blood rush to my face. I was humiliated, furious, and heartbroken all at once. I looked from my angry, confused father to my two smirking, well-dressed siblings, and I had never felt more alone in my life. "You have no idea what you're talking about," I whispered, my voice trembling with rage. "Oh, I think we do," Chloe said, crossing her arms. "We knew this was too much for you. He needs professional care, Scarlett, someone who knows the difference between breakfast and lunch." They weren't trying to help. They were looking for an excuse, a justification for their own absence. My supposed incompetence was their get-out-of-jail-free card. If I was failing, then their decision to abandon the responsibility of care was not only correct but necessary. They didn't stay long. They spoke to Dad in placating, patronizing tones, promising to get this all sorted out. They completely ignored me. As they walked to the door, Mark turned and delivered the final blow. "We'll start looking into facilities tomorrow," he said. "Clearly, this experiment is over." They left. The front door clicked shut, leaving a silence that was more deafening than the earlier shouting. I stood there, frozen in the middle of the kitchen. My father, his burst of anger expended, had slumped in his chair and was now quietly weeping into his hands, the conflict forgotten, leaving only a residue of pure, untethered sorrow. I went to him, knelt down, and wrapped my arms around his shaking shoulders. I didn't say anything. I just held him until his tears subsided. After a few minutes, I cleaned up the oatmeal and I made him a small bowl of mashed potatoes. As he ate them, a faint smile returned to his face. "Thank you," he murmured. "These are good." That night, after I finally got Dad to sleep, Mark called. "We've got a few brochures we're going to email you," he said, his voice businesslike. "There's a place called Oakwood Meadows that looks promising." "Don't bother," I said, my voice cold and hard. "I'm not sending him anywhere. You made your position clear today. You're not interested in helping, only in judging. So from now on, you can stay away. I will handle this." "Don't be ridiculous, Scarlett," he started, but I cut him off. "I am not being ridiculous. I am being serious. You are not welcome here if you're going to behave like that. I will care for him. End of discussion." I hung up the phone before he could reply. I knew in that moment that I was truly on my own. The mashed potatoes incident, as I came to call it in my head, was the breaking point. It was the moment my siblings officially washed their hands of our father, using my incompetence as their justification. It was a cruel, ugly moment, and I thought at the time that it was the worst they could possibly do to me. I was wrong. It was only the beginning. The years that followed the mashed potatoes incident settled into a rhythm of their own, a quiet cadence of care and companionship. The house became our entire world. After that day, Mark and Chloe kept their distance, just as I had demanded. Their absence was both a relief and a persistent, dull ache. They well. Decall maybe once a month, their conversations brief and clinical. "How is he?" Chloe would ask, the same way one might inquire about the weather. "He's okay. We had a good day," I'd reply, leaving out the part where good meant he remembered my name for a full hour or that he hadn't tried to wander out the front door. "Good, good. Well, let us know if anything changes," she'd say, always eager to end the call. Mark's calls were even more perfunctory. "Everything stable, no emergencies, all right, talk soon." Click. They sent a check every month, a precisely calculated sum for Dad's expenses. It was their way of feeling involved, a financial transaction to absolve them of any real responsibility. I deposited every single check into a separate bank account I opened in Dad's name and never touched a penny of it. They had no idea that I was quietly funding everything myself. My secret wealth was my silent partner in this endeavor. After my co-founder and I sold our software company, I was left with a sum of money that was, frankly, staggering. It was more than I could ever need, but I never changed my lifestyle. I didn't buy a fancy car or a sprawling mansion. The money wasn't for me, it was for freedom. The freedom to walk away from work, the freedom to not worry about bills, and now, the freedom to give my father the best possible care without financial strain. I used my own funds to make the house a sanctuary for him. I had discreet safety railings installed in the hallways and bathroom. I replaced the complex stove with a simpler induction cooktop that had an automatic shutoff. I hired a landscape company to maintain the garden he loved, so he could sit on the patio and enjoy it without worrying about the weeds. Twice a week, a wonderful nurse named Maria came for a few hours. She was a godsend. She helped with his bathing, checked his vitals, and provided a level of professional care that gave me peace of mind. More than that, she gave me a lifeline to the outside world. While she was with Dad, I could go for a run, get groceries without rushing, or just sit in a coffee shop and read a book for an hour, recharging my own depleted batteries. I paid Maria generously out of my own pocket. To Mark and Chloe, who knew nothing of her, I was still the unassisted, overwhelmed little sister. It was a narrative they were comfortable with. The days were a patchwork of moments, some beautiful, some devastating. There were afternoons we spent looking through old photo albums, and for a fleeting moment, a picture would spark a lucid memory. He'd point to a photo of my mom. "That was the day we got engaged," he'd say, a genuine smile lighting up his face. "She was so beautiful." In those moments, my father was back, whole and complete, and my heart would swell with a painful, beautiful joy. Then there were the other moments. The times he would become paranoid, accusing me of being an imposter who had taken over his house. The nights he would wake up screaming from nightmares he couldn't describe. The slow, heartbreaking erosion of his basic functions, learning to use a fork again, the struggle with buttons and zippers, the eventual need for adult diapers. Through it all, I documented everything, not for any legal reason, but for my own sanity. I kept a daily journal noting his mood, his food intake, his moments of clarity and confusion. I had a binder filled with his medical records, a log of every doctor's visit, every medication change. I also saved the text messages and emails with my siblings. "Hi guys, just wanted to let you know Dad had a good checkup today. Dr. Evans was pleased with his stability. He's been asking about you both. Maybe you could call him this weekend." And Chloe, TA checks for update. "This WKD is impossible. School board retreat." Mark, Dad was telling stories about your old fishing trips today. It would mean the world to him if you could pop by, even for 20 minutes. Mark, swamped, closing on the Henderson property, can't. The replies were always the same, brief, dismissive, and full of excuses. Their lives were important and busy, mine and Dad's were a footnote. The digital trail of their neglect grew longer and longer, a silent testament to their choices. One year for Dad's 78th birthday, I planned a small celebration. I invited a few of his old friends from the neighborhood and, of course, Mark and Chloe. I baked his favorite German chocolate cake and decorated the living room with balloons. His friends came, sharing old stories that made Dad laugh, even if he didn't quite remember the details. Mark and Chloe never showed up, they didn't even call. Later that evening, I saw a picture Chloe's husband posted on social media. The two of them at a wine tasting event, smiling for the camera, glasses raised. The timestamp was from the middle of Dad's party. I saved a screenshot of it, a bitter taste in my mouth. Caring for my father was the hardest thing I have ever do. It was isolating, exhausting, and emotionally gutting, but it was also strangely beautiful. In the quiet of the house, stripped of all the external markers of success my siblings valued, I found a deeper connection with my dad than I'd ever had. I learned the rhythm of his fears and the language of his confusion. I learned to celebrate the smallest victories, a completed puzzle, a meal eaten without protest, a moment of shared laughter over a silly TV show. I was there for the final chapter of his life, a chapter my siblings chose to skip. I held his hand, I sang his favorite old songs, and I assured him he was loved. I was the one who was there, and at the time, that was all that mattered. The idea that this devotion, this sacrifice, this love could be twisted into a weapon against me was simply unimaginable. The end came peacefully. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon in early spring. The windows were open and the scent of freshly cut grass drifted into the room. Dad had been sleeping more and more, his body finally winding down. Maria, the nurse, was there with me. We sat on either side of his bed, a silent vigil. His breathing became shallow, then softer until it simply stopped. There was no struggle, no final gasp, just a profound and sudden stillness. The grief was immediate, a physical weight pressing down on my chest. But tangled up with the sorrow was a sliver of relief, relief that his struggle was over, relief that he was finally at peace, free from the confusing prison his mind had become. For 5 years, my life had revolved around his. His schedule was my schedule, his needs were my needs. In the deafening silence of his absence, I felt a strange and disorienting sense of being untethered. Telling Mark and Chloe was a surreal experience. I called Chloe first. When I told her Dad had passed, there was a long pause on the line. "Oh," she said finally. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Okay, well, I guess it was for the best. He wasn't really him anymore." It was a clinical assessment, not an expression of grief. Mark's reaction was similar. "Right, okay, so what's next? The funeral arrangements, I assume. I can handle the finances for that, just send me the bills." He had immediately shifted into transactional mode. For him, our father's death was another item on a to-do list, a problem to be managed and solved. The funeral was a masterclass in performance art. Mark and Chloe stood at the front of the funeral home, greeting distant relatives and my father's old friends with practiced, somber expressions. They shook hands, accepted condolences, and played the part of the grieving children perfectly. They spoke of what a wonderful man he was, how much they would miss him. I stood beside them, feeling like a ghost at my own father's service. Their grief felt hollow, a costume they had put on for the day. Several people came up to me, people who had witnessed my daily care, and squeezed my hand. "You were a wonderful daughter," one neighbor whispered. "He was so lucky to have you." Mark and Chloe overheard a few of these comments, and I saw a flicker of annoyance in their eyes. My devotion was an inconvenient reminder of their absence. After the service, back at Dad's, my house, the mask began to slip. While I was making coffee for the few people who had come back, I overheard Mark talking to Chloe in the hallway. "We need to get the house appraised as soon as possible," he said in a low voice. "Market's hot right now. We should list it by the end of the month." "What about all of his things?" Chloe asked. "A estate sale or just a dumpster. Scarlett can handle that. She's here anyway." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. They weren't just discussing logistics, they were liquidating a life, our childhood home, without a single shred of sentiment. To them, it was just an asset. The revelation, the moment the other shoe didn't just drop but crashed through the floor, came 3 weeks later. I was in the garden, finally getting around to planting the new rose bushes I'd bought when my phone rang. It was Mark. His tone was different from any I had ever heard from him. It wasn't dismissive or businesslike. It was sharp, cold, and laced with a venomous fury. "Scarlett," he said, his voice tight, "we need to talk." Mark, what's wrong? There was a pause, and I could hear him breathing heavily like he was trying to control a powerful rage. I had lunch with a friend of mine today, David Mills. He's in finance. We were just catching up, talking about the tech sector, and a name came up. A little company called Logi Stream Solutions. My blood ran cold. It sounded vaguely familiar, he continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I couldn't quite place it, so David looked it up. And imagine my surprise when he pulls up an old press release from 3 years ago. Logi Stream Solutions acquired by Sinatech Corp in nine-figure deal, and whose name is listed as co-founder. And primary shareholder Scarlett Marie Evans. I said nothing. My hand, holding the small gardening trowel, was frozen in the dirt. A nine-figure deal, Scarlett, he hissed. 9 figures, you sold your little computer hobby for over $100 million and you never said a word. It wasn't your business, Mark, I finally managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. He let out a harsh, barking laugh. Not my business, not my business. You let us think you were just scraping by. You played the martyr, the poor, selfless daughter while you were sitting on a fortune. You let us send you money every month for Dad. I never asked for that money and I never spent it, I said, my own anger beginning to rise. It's all sitting in an account in his name. I don't believe you, he spat. It all makes sense now, the reason you were so eager to take care of Dad, the reason you pushed us away. What are you talking about? I took care of Dad because he was my father and I loved him. No, he said, and the certainty in his voice was chilling. You did it to isolate him. You got into his head when he was sick and confused, and you probably had him sign everything over to you. You stole our father's money and you stole our inheritance. The accusation was so monstrous, so completely divorced from reality that I couldn't even process it at first. I just stood there speechless as he laid out his twisted version of the last 5 years. In his version, I was a villain, a cunning manipulator who had preyed on a vulnerable old man. My sacrifice was a scam, my love was a lie. You're going to hear from our lawyer, he said, his voice flat and final. Chloe and I have talked. We are not going to let you get away with this. You owe us. You owe us for Dad's estate, and you owe us for 5 years of deception. He hung up. I stood in the garden, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. The sun was warm on my back, the birds were chirping, but my world had gone completely cold. The brother I knew, the sister I knew, they were gone. In their place were two strangers, their faces distorted by a greed so potent it had rewritten our entire family history. The lawsuit wasn't just about money anymore. It was about destroying me to justify their own failures as a son and a daughter. The formal legal notice arrived by courier 2 weeks later. It was a thick, intimidating manila envelope. My hands trembled as I tore it open. The document inside was filled with dense, impenetrable legalese, but the message was brutally clear. Mark Evans and Chloe Peterson v. Scarlett Evans, my own siblings, my own name. It felt like a declaration of war. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Dad had demanded his mashed potatoes, and I read through the allegations. Each sentence was a carefully constructed fiction, a dagger wrapped in legal jargon. They claimed I had engaged in undue influence, systematically isolating our father from his loving family to gain control of his finances. They accused me of mismanagement of assets, alleging that I had squandered his life savings on my own expenses. The document painted a picture of me as a cold, calculating predator, and of them as the concerned, worried children who had been shut out by my nefarious schemes. The most audacious part was the list of demands. They were suing for the entirety of our father's estate, the house, his modest savings, the untouched money they had sent me, plus punitive damages, and where were those damages to come from? My personal fortune. They wanted a piece of the money I had earned, framing it as compensation for the emotional distress and financial injury my deception had caused them. They had put a price tag on their betrayal, and it was in the millions. My first reaction was a wave of nausea. This wasn't just a disagreement, it was an attempt to assassinate my character, to erase the truth of the last 5 years and replace it with a self-serving lie. The hurt was so profound it was physical, a hollow ache deep in my chest. How could they believe this? How could they twist years of love and sacrifice into something so ugly? But as the initial shock subsided, something else began to bubble up from the depths, a cold, hard anger. It was a clean, clarifying rage. They had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness. They had mistaken my love for my father as an opportunity. They had underestimated me my entire life, and they were doing it again. They thought their attack would make me crumble, that I would offer them a quick, quiet settlement to make them go away. They were wrong. I picked up my phone and did something I never thought I'd have to do. I Googled top litigation lawyers. My meeting with the lawyer, a woman named Eleanor Vance, took place in a high-rise office downtown with a panoramic view of the city. Eleanor was in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that I found instantly re-ass. Uring, I told her everything. I started with the family dynamic, the unserious little sister, the mashed potatoes incident, the years of one-sided communication, and the final, venomous phone call from Mark. I was clinical and precise, pushing my emotions down to present the facts. When I finished, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "They're claiming you isolated him," she said, "but you have years of emails and text messages showing you inviting them to be a part of his life." "Oh yes," I said, "I saved everything." "And they're claiming you mismanaged his funds," she continued, "but you're telling me you never touched their contributions and paid for all the supplementary care, the nurse, the home improvements, out of your own pocket." "That's correct. I have all the bank statements and receipts." "And the core of their case," she said, tapping a pen on the legal document they had sent, "is that you somehow tricked your father into giving you his assets. What was the state of his will?" "It's the same will he and my mom drew up 20 years ago," I explained. "It splits everything 3 ways equally. He never changed it. I never asked him to." Eleanor allowed a small, grim smile to cross her face. "Ms. Evans, Scarlett, your siblings have not brought a lawsuit. They have brought a fantasy novel, a poorly written one at that. Their case is built on greed and delusion. It has no foundation in fact." "So we can fight this?" I asked, a surge of hope cutting through the anger. "Fight it," Eleanor said, leaning forward. "We're not just going to fight it. We are going to dismantle it piece by piece, until they are so buried in the truth of their own neglect they'll wish they had never heard the name Scarlett Evans." Leaving her office that day, I felt a shift inside me. The heartbroken daughter was still there, mourning the family I thought I had, but a new part of me had taken over, a fighter. I was no longer just defending my money. I was defending my father's memory. I was defending the truth of the love and care I had given him. Mark and Chloe had started this war based on a lie about my character. I would end it by exposing the truth of theirs. The first step was hiring a forensic accountant to trace every penny of my father's finances and my own over the past 5 years. It was an invasion of my privacy, but a necessary one. The second step was gathering my evidence: the journal, the binder of medical records, the digital archive of their dismissive messages, the screenshot of their wine-tasting excursion during Dad's birthday party. Each piece of evidence was a small brick in the wall of truth I was building. This wasn't just about winning in court, it was about reclaiming the narrative. My siblings had tried to paint me as a villain. I was about to show the world and them who the real villains were. The legal process is a slow, grinding machine, but with a leaner Vance at the helm, it moved with terrifying efficiency. The first phase was discovery, where both sides are required to provide all relevant documents and evidence to the other. We sent them everything: my detailed journals, the pristine financial records from the forensic accountant, the medical logs, and most importantly, the complete, unedited archive of 5 years of communication. I could only imagine the scene in their lawyer's office as they sifted through the mountain of evidence we provided. They would have seen my hundreds of messages, full of warmth and detail. "Dad watched Singin in the rain today and smiled the whole way through. He's having a tough day with his memory, but a little vanilla ice cream helped. Thinking of you both, Dad would love a call." And then they would have seen the replies from Mark and Chloe, a desert of one-word answers and flimsy excuses. "K, busy? Can't." The contrast was not just stark, it was damning. We had given them the rope, and they had spent 5 years braiding it into a noose for their own case. The real turning point, however, came during the depositions. A deposition is a formal, sworn testimony given out of court. It's a chance for the opposing lawyers to question witnesses under oath. Eleanor decided to depose Mark and Chloe first. I sat beside Eleanor in a sterile conference room as Mark took his seat across from us, his own lawyer at his side. He looked confident, almost arrogant, his suit perfectly pressed. He was ready to perform. Eleanor began gently. Mr. Evans, you claim in your suit that your sister, Scarlett, isolated your father from you. Is that correct? Yes, that's right, Mark said, leaning into the microphone. She made it very difficult for us to see him. There was always an excuse. I see, Eleanor said, opening a thick binder. I have here a printout of a text message you received from your sister on April 12th, 3 years ago. She writes, Mark, Dad was telling stories about your old fishing trips today. It would mean the world to him if you could pop by, even for 20 minutes. Do you recall this message? Mark shifted in his seat. I don't recall that specific message, no. Your reply sent 2 minutes later was swamped, closing on the Henderson property, can't. Do you recall being too busy closing a property deal to see your father? His face flushed slightly. My work is very demanding. Eleanor flipped a page. And here, on your father's 78th birthday, your sister invited you to a small party. You didn't attend. Can you tell us why? We had a prior commitment, Mark said stiffly. Eleanor slid a photograph across the table. It was the screenshot I had saved from social media, Mark and Chloe beaming at the wine tasting. Was this your prior commitment, Mr. Evans? A wine tasting? Is that why you couldn't spare an hour for your father's birthday? Mark stared at the photo as if it were a snake. He was speechless. His lawyer muttered something to him, but the damage was done. For the next 2 hours, Eleanor dismantled him. She asked him to name his father's primary care physician. He couldn't. She asked him what medications his father was taking. He didn't know. She asked him to describe a single typical day in his father's life during the last year. He stumbled, offering vague platitudes about napping and watching TV. His performance of the concerned son crumbled into a pathetic portrait of a neglectful, self-absorbed man. Chloe's deposition was even more devastating. She tried to project an air of calm authority, but under Eleanor's precise questioning, she fell apart. When presented with the email where she'd complained that her son's soccer schedule made it infeasible to visit her dying father, she began to cry, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration and humiliation. The final nails in the coffin were the depositions of Dr. Evans and Maria, the nurse. Dr. Evans testified that in 5 years of treating my father, he had met me over 50 times and had never once met or spoken to Mark or Chloe. He described my care as exemplary and incredibly devoted. Maria's testimony was the most powerful. With quiet dignity, she described the daily reality of our life with Dad. She told the lawyers how I would patiently spoon-feed him for an hour, how I'd sing him old songs to calm his agitation, how I'd hold his hand for hours while he slept. Then Eleanor asked her, in all the time you worked in that house, did you ever see any indication that Scarlett was mistreating her father or misusing his money? Maria looked directly at Mark and Chloe's lawyer. It was the opposite, she said, her voice clear and strong. Scarlett paid for my services, for extra medical supplies, for special food, all from her own money. She told me her father's savings were for his future and she wanted to protect them. The love in that house was the purest thing I have ever seen in my career. What these two have done, she said, glancing at my siblings, is a disgrace to his memory. A week after the depositions, Eleanor got a call from their lawyer. They wanted to talk about a settlement. They are offering to drop the entire lawsuit, Eleanor told me over the phone, if you agree not to countersue for your legal fees. I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the pain and the anger and the sleepless nights. I could have pursued them, punished them financially for what they'd done, but I realized I didn't want to. The fight was over. The truth was out. Tell them I accept, I said. On one condition, I want a signed formal apology, not for me, for Dad. The apology arrived a few days later, a sterile, lawyer-approved document admitting their lawsuit was baseless and expressing regret for the distress caused. It was hollow and meaningless, but it was a written confession of their failure. It was enough. The silence from them since has been absolute. I have not heard their voices, received a text, or seen their names appear on my phone. The ties of family, stretched thin by years of neglect, had finally been severed by their greed, and I felt nothing but peace. In the quiet aftermath of the lawsuit, I found myself standing at a crossroads. The battle was over, the noise had faded, and all that remained was the future. I was alone, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't lonely. I had been tested, pushed to my absolute limit, and I had not only survived, but I had emerged stronger with a clearer sense of who I was and what mattered to me. I sold my father's house. It was a difficult decision filled with ghosts of laughter and sorrow, but it was a necessary one. The house belonged to a family that no longer existed. I held onto a few precious mementos: his favorite armchair, the box of old photographs, the worn copy of Moby Dick he used to read to me. The rest was sold or donated. With the proceeds from the sale, I combined them with the untouched funds my sibling S had sent for 5 years, and I added a substantial sum of my own money. I knew immediately what I had to do with it. My experience with my father had opened my eyes to a world of silent heroes. The spouses, children, and friends who put their own lives on hold to care for loved ones with dementia. They navigate a brutal, heartbreaking journey, often with little to no support, financial or emotional. I established the Robert and Alina Evans Foundation for Dementia Caregivers. My mother's name was Alina, and it felt right to honor them both. The foundation's mission is simple: to provide practical support for family caregivers. We issue grants to help them afford in-home nursing care like Maria. We fund respite programs that give them a desperately needed break. We create support networks, connecting people on this difficult journey so they know they are not alone. The first grant we awarded went to a man in his 60s who had quit his job to care for his wife of 40 years. He was struggling to make ends meet, and the grant allowed him to hire help for a few hours a day so he could rest and run errands without worrying. When I spoke to him on the phone, the gratitude in his voice was overwhelming, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had found my purpose. This was the legacy my father would have wanted. Not a house or a bank account, but a continuation of the love and care he had embodied his whole life. I lost my siblings. I look at old photographs of us as children, 3 kids squished together on a sofa, grinning for the camera, and I feel a pang of sadness for what was lost, for the people they could have been. Money didn't change me, but the revelation of it exposed who they truly were. It was a poison that rotted their character from the inside out. But in losing them, I found something far more valuable. I found a way to transform my pain into purpose, my private grief into public good. I am no longer just Scarlett, the unserious sister. I am Scarlett, the daughter of Robert Evans, and my work is a testament to his memory and a tribute to every person who lovingly cares for someone in the twilight of their life. So, people of YouTube, I have to ask, was I wrong to keep my wealth a secret? Does money change people, or does it simply reveal who they were all along? My siblings sued me because they saw a dollar sign where a sister should have been. They lost, not just in court, but in life. They will live with their bitterness and greed, while I get to live with my father's true legacy, a legacy of love.